Welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Steven Roy Goodman. I'm here in Bloemfontein, South Africa, at the University of the Free State, where we're going to be speaking about world stability. And I have two guests with me today, Hussein Solomon, who's a professor of both political science and gender studies, and Danie Brand, who is a lawyer. And welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. Hussein, maybe if we could start with you, maybe just a very simple question. Has the world ever been stable?
It depends what you define as stability, but in international relations theories, people talk about stability as in the stability of the system. And if you look at that, then of course the world was stable during the multipolar era from roughly the 1500s to 1945. It was roughly stable during vast empires, the time of empires, and it was roughly stable in terms of the Cold War period. Obviously, those on the margins, where proxy wars were fought and so forth, did not experience that stability, but there was stability in terms of the power centers.
And to go further on that, does that simply mean a lack of war, or does it mean people are at peace?
Well, I think that stability is an important ingredient towards peace, but it's not peace. Yeah, Johan Galtung in the 1960s spoke about negative peace. So I would suggest that world stability is order, and peace comes after order is established. But then if I was a Marxist or something like that, I would then say, well, whose peace? Who benefits from it? And so forth.
And from a legal perspective, Danie, do you agree with that?
Well, I think one must ask the right question here, and I think the question is not so much whether there were periods of stability. I think the question is stability for whom, from which perspective stability exists. And if I think one adopts that approach, then it becomes really difficult to say that there were any really stable periods in world history. I'm not an expert and by any means in world history, but because stability and whether it exists, peace and whether it exists, depends on one's perspective. And I think in any era in world history, one can point out that from a particular perspective, the world would not have been peaceful, the world would not have been stable.
Well, to follow up on that for a second, so I suppose one could then look at overall society, but also a subpart of society, people who live in a particular city or people who live in a particular part of a country.
Indeed, and I'm a lawyer. I can use South African legal history as an example. If one were to ask a South African lawyer, and let's say a white South African lawyer of a particular political persuasion, whether there has ever been a period of stability in the legal system in South Africa, then the answer would very quickly be, well, yes, probably from roughly 1910 until 1994, when the new constitution was adopted. Our common law, our private law, our law of contract and law of property and law of delict remained, from a certain perspective, really stable. But if you were to ask a black person that same question, your answer would be completely different, because in that same period of stability, there was a project of social engineering ongoing in South Africa, driven through law. And law in South Africa was constantly changing from a statutory perspective during that time. So perspective is everything in that question.
Then how do we look at world stability when a big magazine is covering it or a big newspaper is covering it? Then perhaps, if I'm hearing what both of you are saying, then it's really picking and choosing what you're saying to cover that article, because it depends whose perspective you're looking at.
Well, I think I want to take a step back and ask whether how one thinks about stability and how one thinks about the value of stability. And I think it's important for me, at least. It's also important for me as a scholar of law and as a lawyer to say that stability is never an end in itself. Stability cannot, to my mind, be described as a value that is worth pursuing. Stability is a circumstance that serves other ends. In other words, you can have justice and you can have peace and you can have prosperity if there is stability. stability serves those other substantive ends. In the first place and the second place, if one accepts that, then one also accepts that those other substantive ends depend on stability as a set of circumstances for them to be there. And it also means that there is never really stability, because stability and the achievement of those substantive ends are always in tension with each other. If you find yourself in a situation where you think the world is unjust, then the thing that you have to combat almost to achieve justice is necessarily stability.
Hussein, do you agree with that?
I think that the point of perspective is very important, as I stated, but I also think then it becomes too relative. I think that the world was more stable before Russia's intervention into Ukraine. I think it is less stable now, and there's a high possibility of it becoming something major, as in a major war. I think there are also issues, for example, around the Iran nuclear weapons. I think that there are issues of Taiwan and what's happening there. And so I do believe there are periods of stability and instability. I do believe that stability is a positive value, and that other things like human rights, justice, and all of those things come in after you have order. To come to South Africa, one of the major challenges is that South Africa is showing all the ingredients of being a failed state. And in that context, where there's no enforcement in terms of crime, for example, is one thing, then you have a huge problem. And I think that the rights and issues of justice of individuals is all stripped away. So you need order.
Well, let's follow up on that. So, but people, I mean, Mussolini's era, he said, well, we need order, and therefore there was order, and there was order. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it was a positive thing for the world.
No, I mean, look, we can talk about China, and in terms of, I mean, you have an authoritarian system in terms of China, and yet you have a communist party which is in charge of one of the most successful capitalist revolutions in the world, bringing 200 million people out of poverty. Do I like the Chinese political system? No. But look at what happened, like, in the entire history. They had a problem with the center controlling the vast mass in terms of China. And to be honest with you, coming from a South African perspective, I would much prefer that order than the chaos that is ensuing in South Africa, where a government cannot fix potholes, cannot provide electricity or provide drinking water to citizens. Yeah.
And so you think that it's hard for there to be that stability because the order doesn't exist?
Because the institutions and the structures don't exist. The rules of the game is being flouted. It's not being enforced, and so forth. Both at a country level, if I take South Africa, but also at the international level, when those norms is destroyed and so forth. I'm not necessarily saying that there is no global north and global south, and some people are not being oppressed by others or exploited by others and so forth. But I am saying that when you violate certain rules of the game in such a massive way, it destabilizes the order and is negative to human security.
Danie, do you have a thought or two about that?
Well, I would return to my previous point, which is really that stability and change are constantly in tension. Of course, stability is something that one needs in order to create a just and a peaceful and a prosperous world. But sometimes the conditions are such that they precisely need to change in order for one to attain stability itself, but also the more important substantive goals of prosperity, peace, and justice. And the South African example is a perfect one. I mean, in apartheid South Africa, the Minister of what is today called Justice was called the Minister of Law and Order. And I think that is significant that Hussein used the word order. It is possible to have order And it very often happens that there is order and extreme examples of order in a completely unjust and therefore also a completely potentially unpeaceful and unprosperous world. And that's the history of South Africa. We are in a different situation now, and there are different reasons for that. And certainly one of the imperatives that faces South Africa today is the establishment of some kind of order and some kind of stability within which one can operate. But that remains a mechanism for achieving the underlying substantive goals, which are broadly speaking justice.
But if we take your example, which is an interesting one of the kind of dynamic tension between the two, in your mind, is there a society who's ever gotten that right, where there's enough order to keep going, but enough justice that it's just?
So in law, of course, stability, we refer to it as certainty in law, it's a central aspect of, I suppose, the very foundational idea of law, is that law, there must be some kind of predictability and certainty and stability in a legal system for purposes of justice, so that people know what the law says and requires of them to do so that they can operate within those confines. But take South Africa as an example, post-1994. So on the one hand, there is the imperative to establish a new legal system and to establish the certainty of that new legal system. On the other hand, there is an imperative to change a whole society, to transform a whole society, and law is an important instrument for that. So I would say a nuanced lawyer today would say that one in developing law, in applying law, and I would dare to extrapolate that to a society, one must endeavor to maintain constantly that tension between stability on the one hand and change, transformation, which is a more acute form of change, on the other. And I can give examples in law where our legal system has incorporated that tension in a way that strives towards stability and that provides a measure, a framework of stability, but at the same time still allows for change and allows for transformation.
I think that when you look at stability and change, these are not necessarily opposite things. And it's the issue of sequencing for me. So I spent a fair amount of my time looking at issues of democratization. And one of the key ingredients for democratization is a middle class. And in terms of South Africa, one of the big problems that we had post-94 was we were so focused in on the political transformation that we did not allow market forces to be unleashed and to actually grow the pie so there could be proper redistribution and things like that. One of the major reasons for the Arab Spring turning into an Arab winter was the fact that there was no independent middle class from the state. So, in my view, what the countries, I mean, if you look at Lee Kuan Yew in terms of Singapore, I absolutely loved what he did, but he himself did not run a democratic state. But are Singaporeans better today? Absolutely. I also have an issue, and I mean, I was on the wrong side of the apartheid thing because of my skin color, because of the political affiliation of my family and stuff like that. I mean, my dad was in prison for several years. My brother was in exile because of the objection to the apartheid state. But there were 21,000 political murders in South Africa during the 46 years of apartheid. Thabo Mbeki's AIDS denialism alone cost us 330,000 lives. So this idea about 94 being some sort of major milestone is problematic, and we need to look at it, given the fact that we're talking about stability, world stability. We need to look at these things using a comparative lens. So to come back to it, I think that change, justice, and so on is only possible if there's order.
But to use your example about Thabo Mbeki and the AIDS work that he did or didn't do versus the political violence that took place before the transition to democracy, it seems to me like we're comparing an apple to an orange. How do we compare that in a fair way? Maybe I'll throw that to both of you.
Well, look, I think that obviously the apartheid system wasn't working for the majority of the people, but I also don't think that the post-94 order has been working, and we need to make that clear. I mean, coming back to the issue of world stability, the only way the change was possible in South Africa was, if you look at what F.W. de Klerk said, more than 90% of the world, including the USA, imposed sanctions. The 1986 Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act was passed by the US Congress. And we couldn't trade. And that served as a catalyst. The issue of transformation, I think there was too much of emphasis put on form as opposed to substance. So, for example, you change a road name from an Afrikaner name to a liberation hero's name, but the road itself is filled with potholes. Makes no sense to me. So, I've been very, very strongly being a supporter of Francis Fukuyama's The Origins of Political Order. And if you read that book, order comes first. And I think that the US itself made several mistakes in terms of promoting democracy elsewhere in the world, because it can become a form of instability. Because sometimes parties are not mobilized along Republican versus Democratic lines in the US. They are mobilized along ethnic lines, along clan lines on the African continent, for instance. In terms of the Arab world, when you had the Arab Spring, after Hosni Mubarak was overthrown, you got the Muslim Brotherhood in power until, of course, ousted by a military coup. So you have to think through how you calibrate the demands for justice in terms of the long-term consequences. We are talking about world stability. So, an example for me would be Afghanistan. The US armed the Mujahideen after the Soviet Union's invasion, which became Al-Qaeda. That was pretty dumb. And so you have to think through what are the consequences for pushing this in terms of your broader world stability.
And to push the issue of that from a legal perspective, almost none of that is legal, but countries do it anyway. So are you saying that those things should not have happened?
What particular aspect?
Renaming the road, the U.S. going into Afghanistan in the first place. So do we not do anything and just wait for the potholes to be fixed? And
I'll give you an example. Here, you can rename roads, but renaming the road that's just the form. It's not the substance of actually tarring the road, having a functioning municipality. Our municipality, Mangaung, in which you are located in now, is under administration, right? Order, strong institutions, incorruptible institutions come first. In terms of the U.S., the U.S. supported the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. Okay, it makes sense in terms of the Cold War, epoxy, bleed the Soviet Union dry, and so on. But they should have had thought of the consequences of that action in terms of creating a grouping there, having supplied them with weapons and stuff. How do you get those weapons back? Okay? Inside South Africa, there's a lot of debate about a universal basic income grant and so on. Makes great sense. But our economy is in serious trouble, and it will destroy the economy. And you have professionals leaving the country. Does it make sense? What comes first, order or justice? In my view, order first, with a view towards creating justice in the short to medium to long term. Anne Bernstein at the Center for Development and in the Enterprise, there's just so much of emphasis of minimum, the government wants people to be paid more in terms of minimal jobs and so on. But if you look at the examples of the Asian tigers and so on, how they went up, doing menial tasks, but getting everyone employed, growing the cake, diversifying, creating more sophisticated economies and so on. And I think that, justice or human rights or anything else within chaos isn't going to work.
Yes, Steve, there's a lot with which I disagree. in what Hussein has just said concerning specific issues such as, for example, what led to the fall of apartheid. I don't think it is any one thing that led to the fall of apartheid. Whether we should in South Africa today have a basic income grant university or otherwise or not. So a whole range of issues that I disagree with him about. But I'm obviously going to leave those for the moment. I think what for me is at the center of my perceived disagreement with Hussein is that I don't think it makes sense to distinguish between order or stability on the one hand and change linked to justice and transformation on the other hand. It doesn't make sense in a conceptual way. It also doesn't make sense across time. I disagree that one can so clearly distinguish between the apartheid era and what happened in the apartheid era and what came thereafter, and make comparisons between those two eras, as Hussein sought to do, because there is a great deal of continuity, of course, between those two different eras. The effects of apartheid will be with us for a very long time still in South Africa. One small example that Hussein referred to, and that we discussed also before the interview, has to do with arms. South Africa is a country that is flooded with weapons, flooded with guns. That is directly the consequence of efforts of the apartheid era government to do so, in order to sow chaos, in order to make things difficult in what came after them. The networks of criminality that Hussein referred to before, those networks of criminality were established and were nurtured to some extent under apartheid, both inside the apartheid government, and it is easy for another network simply to step into the shoes of a network that existed before, and also within the liberation movements for a wide variety of reasons. So I wouldn't make that distinction, and therefore I wouldn't say that it is possible to say that order has to come before justice, or order has to come before human rights. I think it's I don't want to say facile, Hussein, but I think it is an incorrect distinction to make.
But we're obviously very political. But let's assume there's somebody who lives a few kilometers from here who has no real interest in politics, just trying to get along with his or her life and go to the supermarket, get some food, send some children to school. How would they sort out this discussion in both of your mind?
Well, someone who faces a problem like that, and very many people in South Africa currently do, to the extent that I think we can say we're in a crisis, people will have to agitate precisely for change, to achieve stability in their lives, to achieve the justice that they seek in their lives, to be able to live their lives in an ordinary, humdrum way. They will have to agitate for and work for change. The only way it's going to be achieved is for things to change. And once it is achieved, there will always be a new challenge, and there will always be a new problem that also has to be combated and fought against in some way. So that's that tension between stability and change that I refer to.
I just think that people are agitating on the street for change. The problem is that it's generally destructive. There are about 13 violent protests every single day in South Africa. People are predicting civil war with an electricity shutdown, amongst other things, rising food and inflation prices. the lack of legitimacy of the ruling ANC, the fact that other political parties do not provide an alternative. So there can be agitation, people mobilizing, but I don't really, I'm sorry if I'm rather being pessimistic, but I think that we're going to go through much more instability, chaos, before there's any likelihood of any positive change in this country.
But why does that fall to, and I don't know if that's true or not true, but why does that fall to the average person rather than the people in power? So it's almost as if we're turning it on its head, that the people who are affected by things that you're saying are not going well have the burden to change things.
You are absolutely right, but this government, which has been in power since '94, right, and has basically run the country into ruin. Last Friday, we were grey-listed, as you know, because of terrorist funding and all kinds of things, and loopholes in terms of corruption by the Financial Action Task Force, amongst other things. The rand past 18 rand to the dollar. We are, and the government is unable to change. Even people who supported Cyril Ramaphosa after he became president, following on Jacob Zuma, don't believe in the possibility of change. So, unfortunately, South Africans are going out on the street, and it is not right for them to come up with an alternative and so on. But when they vote, they prefer not voting. So you have larger and larger numbers, especially younger people, who prefer taking out their anger on the street rather than going into to try to effect change via the ballot box. Okay, and given the number of political assassinations and so on in South Africa, I am deeply concerned about the possibility of that. Because the ANC is less a political party and more a predatory group stealing from South Africans.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap that up. I would just like to say before we do that the views expressed here are not necessarily the views, my views, or any of the stations that run this show. However, I think it is important to point out that what we've been talking about today, and I'm looking directly at you, the audience, shows the vibrancy of the democracy in South Africa, that we are able to have this discussion. Whether or not you agree with our guests or not today, I would urge you to please research their writings. I would urge you to please not only read about South African history and current events in South Africa, but think for yourselves as to what you think ought to happen, and to think about whether or not world stability does exist in South Africa, and whether it will continue to exist or not exist here. If you would like additional information about the University of the Free State, please go to ufs.ac.za. If you would like to send a note to me at the show, please go ahead and do so by sending an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.